CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Paul Barber.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Slower growth and higher inflation. The European Central Bank confirms it plans to raise interest rates for the first time in more than a decade.
China's exports bounce higher than expected, but challenges remain for the country's economic recovery.
Russia flexes its military muscle as Ukraine's president says a brutal battle in Severodonetsk will decide the fate of the entire Donbas region.
And the PGA suspends players taking part in a new Saudi-backed golf tournament teeing off near London. The European Central Bank has confirmed it plans to raise interest rates for the first time in more than a decade. ECB head Christine Lagarde said it could be the first in a series of rate hikes unless inflation is brought under control.
European shares fell into the red after the bank also ended a long-running stimulus scheme and said growth across the Eurozone will be lower than expected. Well, our correspondent Trent Murray is in Berlin. So, Trent, were these changes expected?
Well, Robin, I think in some ways the ECB was dragged to this position kicking and screaming. Christine Lagarde for some time has been sort of talking down the pressures of inflation in the Eurozone, but I think the reality now is really starting to set in that the Governing Council of the Eurozone does have a bit of a situation on its hands and it needs to take action. And for that reason, we saw this announcement that they won't be raising interest rates this month, but they will be doing it next month. 25 basis points was the announcement. There is some speculation this afternoon that some members of the council wanted to go further, like other central banks, like the Australian Reserve Bank, for example, has done this week, going 50 basis points. But Christine Lagarde is kind of taking the slow and steady approach, a fairly expected measure that we would normally get from the Frankfurt-based institution. Of course, she says inflation, like we have been reporting really for months now, is running red hot across Europe, driven heavily by energy prices off the back of the war in Ukraine. But she also said it is starting now to seep into other areas of the economy, in goods and in services. And for that reason, the ECB now feels like it does indeed need to raise interest rates. A significant announcement, as you say, because it is the first time they have done that in over a decade. Let's have a listen to what Christine Lagarde had to say about the rationale behind this decision.
High inflation is a major challenge for all of us. The Governing Council will make sure that inflation returns to our 2% target over the medium term. In May, inflation again rose significantly, mainly because of surging energy and food prices, including due to the impact of the war.
And there was another announcement from the ECB about stimulus measures.
Yeah, that's right. The ECB is going to be bringing to an end its stimulus program, its bond buying stimulus program. Now, that is going to come to an end within the next 3 weeks. That essentially has been a long-running program that effectively saw the bank pump money into the economy of the Eurozone as part of what's known as a quantitative easing measure. Now, it was particularly used over the COVID-19 pandemic when really the stock markets and the economy took a big hit. It was essentially a tool to try and keep the economies on life support. But of course, critics of that policy say now they really need to start backtracking on those types of generous pumping in of the economy, huge amounts of money, because it itself is driving inflation. It follows a similar decision made by the Fed in the US as well as the Bank of England. Europe now is going that way, trying to turn off the taps to that spending. The reason being, because as we heard in that remark there from Christine Lagarde, the benchmark for Eurozone inflation is 2%. That is the target. But this year, the new revisions suggest it will be 6.8%, well beyond where they want to be, and that is really now kicking into gear measures by the European Central Bank.
Trent, many thanks. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin.
Well, economic growth in the United Kingdom will grind to a halt, with inflation hitting 10% soon. That's according to the British Chamber of Commerce, a major business organisation.
It comes as the price of an average tank of petrol in a car tops $125 for the first time. Well, that's symbolic because it equates to 100 British pounds.
China's exports for May grew by more than double the expected rate. Outbound shipments were up nearly 17% on a year ago, an encouraging sign for the world's second biggest economy after lockdowns forced factories to close for long periods. Imports also rose for the first time in 3 months. Well, Mark Oswald is Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mark. Good to see you again. So, looking at the data, exports grew by 16.9% in May compared with a year earlier, up from 3.9% growth in April. What do you make of these improved numbers?
I think they tell two stories. The first is that the expected drop-off in demand for Chinese goods is not materialising. It really serves to tell us of the strength of the recovery, of the reopening recovery that we've got, both in Europe and in North America. On the other hand, one has to be a little bit careful here because this is a value-based measure, not a volume-based measure. So some of the value, increased value, is actually just a reflection of inflation. More encouraging to a certain extent was the rise in imports, though that too was flattered by inflation, but at least they've risen for the first time in 3 months. I think one has to be a little bit careful here about the outlook, though, because in principle, we're seeing big build-ups of inventories in Europe and above all in North America in the retail sector in goods. And so some of the demand may actually start to drop off. And when one looks at things like electronic circuit exports, those two, or rather imports, those two were dropping off, which implies things like anything to do with telecoms are probably not going to actually do quite as well in the recovery. And the really complex question here is, this recovery from the shutdowns, how long is it going to last? We already saw today that the parts of Shanghai were being closed down again. So it may still be very stop-start.
Yeah, so as you say, a lot of uncertainties still on the horizon, and this might be a little hard to call, but if you could guess, how quickly would you say China's recovery from the recent lockdowns specifically could be?
I think it could be quite rapid. I think one thing which, the strongest indicator of the recovery would be a bigger bounce in imports. But at the moment, and this was evident even in today's data, there is certainly a degree of resistance to paying some of the prices for raw materials above all. And you can see that particularly in the oil data. Notably, they seem to be benefiting at the moment from imports of Russian oil because the average price, the imputed Russian average price, was down at $77 average versus $80 in April, while oil prices on the open market went up. So they are benefiting on that front, but there are other things where the prices having risen so sharply may actually make them rather loath to import at these very elevated levels, particularly given domestic demand is very reliant on getting the construction sector going again. And that's, still a lot of work in progress because the property sector is still not through all of the woes that have been going on for well over a year now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the war in Ukraine, of course, having an impact on metal prices, crude and soybeans, of which China is heavily reliant on overseas imports. Is there a concern that rising prices will further dent any recovery?
I think that to a certain extent, the Chinese are very, very good at managing their imports on that front. But in terms of the agricultural side, it is going to be more problematic because there's a lot of, basically we've got reduced resources or availability of agricultural resources at the moment, and that actually is a problem. The other problem is also unemployment is still quite high in China, and there is clear concern being voiced by policymakers there, both in government and in central bank, that you may not sort of see the pickup in consumer spending that we really need to see to get this economy going, and not so reliant on export demand, because that will drop off as the year goes on, particularly as other economies around the world basically get back to a normal modus operandi. It won't be the same as before, but it's a more normal modus operandi.
Mark Oswald, many thanks indeed.
My pleasure.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken of a brutal battle in Severodonetsk, which he says will decide the fate of the entire Donbas region.
Its mayor says it's now impossible to evacuate civilians from the city due to the fighting. But in the south, Ukraine's defense ministry says it's won back some territory in Kherson.
Well, let's talk now to Associated Press reporter Philip Crowther, who's in Lviv. So, Philip, Ukraine's still holding on in Severodonetsk, but grim reports coming from the city. Are we at risk of it becoming another Mariupol, or is Russia gaining ground more quickly?
Well, that comparison to Mariupol is one that visually at least makes sense from what we're seeing in Severodonetsk, but also what we're hearing from what is actually happening there during that battle for the city in the Luhansk province. But the governor of that province has rejected that comparison so far. He says, though, that there are street battles in the city and that the Ukrainian army will be fighting for every street and house. We've also heard from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. He says that what is happening in that city right now, that is alongside the city of Lysychansk, makes up essentially 3 or 5% of that province that is still in Ukrainian hands. He says this is the epicenter of the fight for the Donbas region, also adding that it is perhaps one of the most difficult battles of this war. He said that during his nightly address to the Ukrainian people, which he recorded outside of the presidential palace in Kiev. Later, a few hours ago today, in fact, he spoke virtually to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD.
Russia is simply destroying the Donbas with ruthless rocket, air and artillery strikes. It's one of the world's significant industrial regions with deep coal mines and metallurgical and chemical plants. This Russian bombardment poses a pollution threat to huge territories, pollution of underground waters and rivers, and pollution of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea.
President Zelensky of Ukraine there about the far-reaching consequences of Russia's war in Ukraine. Now, you mentioned some Ukrainian advances, specifically in that province of Kherson, that's in the south of the country. There had been some counteroffensives staged by the Ukrainian army, and they appear to have held, essentially.
And Philip, 3 foreign soldiers fighting with Ukraine have just been sentenced to death by a court in Russian-controlled Donetsk. What more can you tell us?
Well, this has been condemned by the British government, calling this a sham judgment. Now, these 3 men are Aidan Aslin, Sean Pinner and Saudoun Brahim, 2 British citizens and 1 Moroccan. They have been sentenced to death by firing squad, says the Russian state news agency, that they have a month to appeal. Presumably that appeal will happen. Now, according to that court in the Donetsk area of Ukraine, they were mercenaries. They were fighting alongside or with the Ukrainian army in Mariupol during that time when the steel plant there was still holding out for as long as possible. Now, the most important thing to note here, though, of course, and when the British government talks about a sham judgment, is that it actually happened in a court that, first of all, is not internationally recognized, and it also happened in an area, in one of these so-called self-proclaimed independent republics. There's one in Luhansk, and then there's this one in Donetsk. These regions are also not internationally recognized, except, of course, with that notable exception of Russia.
Philip, many thanks. Philip Crowther from the Associated Press in Lviv.
Well, Russia says it's been unable to reach a deal with Turkey on exporting Ukrainian grain shipments across the Black Sea. It follows warnings that millions of people around the world could starve because ports are blockaded. Our correspondent Stuart Smith is in Moscow, and a reminder that journalists in Russia are working under media laws that restrict what they can report. Stuart, the Kremlin's been speaking out about this grain crisis. What did we find out?
Yeah, on Thursday, the Kremlin was specifically addressing the allegation that it is stealing grain from the occupied southern regions of Ukraine. The Kremlin did confirm that it is attempting to arrange a deal with Turkey and/or Middle East countries about exporting that grain, but did not confirm whether this is the same grain which regional governors said was being transported by rail via Crimea and then exported from the ports there. This is something that is just one part of a larger dispute over grain exports. The other thing, which is the focus of international diplomacy right now at the United Nations, is the unblocking of the Ukrainian ports, which are still under Ukrainian control. Russia says that it is not implementing any sort of naval blockade, and the reason that ships cannot get in or out to export goods is because of mines that Ukrainian Navy laid in the Black Sea. Ukraine says that it is possible for it to clear those mines only once it has security guarantees from Russia or from the international community that it is not going to use that opportunity to attack the coast. And that's why Russia's been talking to Turkey, but Ukraine would even rather see international partners like the UK or France be involved. Then there's this third issue, which the Kremlin would certainly rather focus on, which is that of Western sanctions imposed upon Russia, which it says are fundamental to the problem of grain exports around the world for Russian goods, notably fertilizer and wheat, and it says that these would have to be lessened for Russia to start making a contribution to those shortages of grains and those high food prices. But that's something the West has ruled out, and something that the Kremlin has made clear is not currently under discussion with any of the European Union or American partners.
Moscow has also said it doesn't expect any more gas cuts to European customers. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is what seems to possibly be, for now at least, the end of a major gas dispute which started when Russia demanded that any importers of Russian gas from so-called unfriendly countries would have to pay in rubles into Russian bank accounts and then have that transferred into the Gazprom provider of Russian gas. That was something that some countries feared would break EU sanctions. Then the EU made clear there would be exceptions so they could continue to keep importing, but some countries decided not to accept that offer. This was Denmark, the Netherlands, Bulgaria, Poland and Finland. They had their gas cut off for non-payment in April and May, but now the Kremlin confirms that any other country which had been importing Russian gas and still is, if they haven't had their gas cut off, then it's clear they have arranged with Russia to make those payments, despite how uncomfortable some of these importers would find that. This comes the same day that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson warned that these high gas prices, these high grain prices and other energy prices look set to remain for a long time. And a few hours ago in the US, one security envoy told lawmakers that it's quite possible that Russia has not been affected by specifically the energy sanctions because of these high energy prices, that in fact it's making more than it was before February.
Stuart, thank you very much. Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Still to come on CGTN. The world's most lucrative golf tournament gets underway near London. But is it just a way for organisers Saudi Arabia to get its reputation out of the rough?
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hi there, welcome back. Golf now, and the PGA Tour has suspended all its players who are taking part in the controversial new Saudi-funded Live Invitational Series, which has teed off near London. It's the most lucrative golfing tournament in the world, with a prize fund of $25 million for the first event.
America's Phil Mickelson is being paid a reported $200 million to take part, but there are high-profile opponents too. Tiger Woods turned down an invitation, and those playing have been accused of sports-washing the Saudi regime. Well, our correspondent Guy Henderson is at the Centurion Club in St Albans, where this event is taking place. Guy, the PGA Tour suspending all of its members that are involved in this event. Why has this series divided the world of golf so much?
I think, firstly, because it's seen as a major threat by the established order. The original idea was that this tournament would be able to run alongside both the PGA and European tours. A number of big stars, big names from those tours are here in St Albans taking part. The world number 15, Dustin Johnson, the PGA champion from 2021, Phil Mickelson, they're both taking part. But it does have big critics amongst them, and one of the players not here, the current world number 8, Rory McIlroy, who said that he thought that the only reason his colleagues and competitors were taking part in this competition was for what he described as a boatload of cash. The PGA, as you say, has now, just as things were teeing off here, decided to suspend those big names that decided to take part. They said they broke the rules, that they had no permission to be here. So that will cause, I think, a deeper rift between these two competing forces in world golf. What's also controversial is that this competition is being bankrolled principally by the Public Investment Fund, whose chairman is the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, that Western intelligence agencies say was implicit in the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Some of those big names here have been asked about that. Should they be taking part at all? Here's one of their responses.
This has been incredibly polarizing. I think we all agree up here, take the Khashoggi situation, we all agreed that that was reprehensible. No one's going to argue that fact. But we're golfers, and speaking personally, I really feel like, golf's a force of good in the world. If Saudi Arabia wanted to use the game of golf as a way for them to get to where they want to be, and they have the resources to accelerate that experience, I think we're proud to help them on that journey.
Well, Liv have now released their own statement in response to that PGA suspension announcement, calling it vindictive and saying it will deepen the divide between the tour and its members.
And we have seen Saudi investment in sport before, of course, but this is a brand new series. It seems like the biggest step yet.
Yeah, the Saudis have poured $600 million into Formula One. They've recently taken control of Newcastle Football Club for another $400 million. Initially, this is a $250 million tour that runs through 8 events. But the winner here is going to walk away with $4 million. Compare that to the Masters. The winner there gets only $2.7 million. But the Saudis have promised that they're going to plough $2 billion into this competition in the years ahead. They're going to make it a 14-event tour by 2014. OK,
Guy Henderson in St Albans in the UK. Thanks very much.
Sophie Walker is a golf analyst and a former Ladies European Tour golfer. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Firstly, could I ask for your reaction to the PGA Tour suspending all players taking part in the Live Series? Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't. That's what the golf world thought would happen as soon as the tee shot was hit today in London, that we was going to hear from the PGA Tour. And they have very much said that if you play in these live events and you are suspended from the PGA Tour, they thanked their members that have stuck with them. Remember, this is a members association, and they're saying if you go and play on another tour, you will jeopardise this PGA Tour and you will be suspended. I think many of the players thought this would come. You have seen the likes of Dustin Johnson resign from the PGA Tour already, probably because he didn't want to, well, the fine, probably not a big issue for Dustin Johnson, he's just been paid $100 million, but he didn't want to be banned for the majors, and so he's already said, that's okay, I'm no longer a member of the PGA Tour.
So how much of a threat does the PGA really think it is, do you think?
I honestly think at the beginning, they didn't even think about it. The PGA Tour has upped their prize funds, they have a FedEx playoffs at the end of the year where the winner gets $15 million. I think they thought, well, this is absolutely fine. We're giving our members everything they want. We've upped the money for social media. If you're good on social media, you get a bonus. They did not anticipate the influx from a whole country. Now, we've seen it in football, the likes of Manchester City being owned by Abu Dhabi and Qatar owning PSG. When they are up against a whole country, things change. And the money which is being talked about, I mean, golfers play for a lot of money anyway, but this is, like Rory said, boatloads of money.
Yeah, it's just eye-watering, isn't it? What do you make of the amounts involved?
I can't even comprehend them, in fairness. Being a woman golfer, we've never played for that type of money. This week in Canada, PGA Tour, their prize fund is $8.7 million. And this week in London, the men are playing for $25 million. It becomes just incredible. But what I'm thinking of is normally at golf, everyone starts on zero and you have an opportunity to win money. A lot of these guys are getting paid just to tee it up, which is then leading some of the golf world to say, is this like an exhibition? What's the importance of this? Nobody spoke about winning a trophy, that everyone's just been speaking about the money. So what I want to know as a golf fan is what the product's going to be like.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about the sort of practicalities of it. How does this tournament work? How different is the format from, say, a normal golf tournament?
Well, a normal golf tournament is 72 holes stroke play, which is normally 4 days of work for the men or the women. This is 54 holes, so 1 day less work. There's no cut, so everyone will play from start to finish. It's a shotgun start at 2:15 in the afternoon, which means all the players are on the golf course at the same time, but they don't start on the first hole and finish on the 18th. We could see a winner on Saturday on the 6th green, which is quite a weird thing. Also, there is a team element as well. 4 of the guys, they were picked in a draft on Tuesday night, so there's 1 team captain and 3 picks. They form a team. One of them's called the Maverick, another one's called the 4 Aces, and they come together. Most of the money goes towards the individual, which is 20 million, but 5 million goes to the team event also.
So 1 day, less work, more money. You can see why players might be interested. Can you talk us through the lineup of some of the names playing and maybe some of those conspicuous by their absence?
Well, the big name was Dustin Johnson. When he signed, everybody started looking. And now we've seen the likes of Bryson DeChambeau saying, I'll play in the next one. What makes this significant is they are very current players, top 20 players in the world, recent major winners. Then you look down the list and you're looking at Ryder Cup veterans of Ian Poulter, Graham McDowell, Lee Westwood, who are coming towards the end of their career. And like you said, you can't fault them by wanting to take one big final paycheck. There's also quite a lot of Southern Hemisphere golfers. The likes of Louis Oosthuizen is playing, Justin Harding. Now, these South Africans pack a suitcase and they don't come home for months on end. They have travelled the world for many years, and a lot of them are thinking, for 8 weeks for this amount of money. Think of all the time I could spend in South Africa with my family. So I work less, get paid more. It's a no-brainer. That is what the players are thinking.
Yeah, can't blame them at all. Well, thank you so much, Sophie Walker. Fascinating to hear your thoughts. Much appreciated.
The Chinese securities regulator has denied reports it's given Jack Ma's Ant Group the green light to revive its IPO. The China Securities Regulatory Commission said it has not completed its assessment, but supports eligible platform companies who wish to be listed both domestically and internationally. Meanwhile, Ant Group said there was no plan to revive its IPO, adding it's focused on steadily moving the company forward.
Twitter will hand internal data to Elon Musk following a standoff over his bid to buy the platform. US media quoted unnamed sources saying the company will provide background information on hundreds of millions of tweets. It comes after the Tesla boss demanded proof of the number of fake accounts and threatened to pull out of his $44 billion takeover. Twitter says fewer than 5% of its accounts are fake.
New Zealand has unveiled draft plans to tax burps from sheep and cattle in a bid to tackle one of the country's biggest sources of greenhouse gases. It would make it the first nation to charge farmers for methane emissions from their livestock. New Zealand is home to just over 5 million people, along with around 10 million cattle and 26 million sheep.
Now, the first in our new series aimed at inspiring anyone looking for their first job. Caroline Casey is an award-winning entrepreneur who was born with an eye disorder that means she can only see a few centimetres in front of her.
Casey set up Valuable 500, an initiative that's seen businesses, including Microsoft and Google, commit to including people with disabilities in senior leadership. She told us how she began her career working for her father.
I've always been a troublemaker. I'm a daughter of a troublemaker. And my very first job was cleaning toilets in his factory. And he used to come and inspect my work. And as a blind person, I mean, I am the best toilet cleaner in the world. Because what I couldn't see, he made sure that I would really deliver a clean toilet. My dad taught me never to make excuses. I am responsible for my career. And if it goes wrong, I have to be responsible to make it go right. I was never allowed to use my sight as an excuse. And so that toilet had to be clean. And that's why I think through the Valuable 500 is this: I will never give up. You are never to give up. Nobody else has a right to tell you how to live your life. You've got to listen to yourself, and you've got to be accountable.
And later this week, we find out how best-selling children's author Michael Rosen and the chairman of Premier League football club Wolves started out. Head to our CGTN Europe social media accounts to find out more.
Yeah, some great stories there. Do check it out. Still ahead on the programme, fears of gas shortages in Europe after an explosion at a liquefied natural gas plant in Texas.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with global business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Paul Barber. The headlines again. Slower growth and higher inflation. The European Central Bank has confirmed it plans to raise interest rates for the first time in more than a decade.
China's exports bounce higher than expected, but challenges remain for the country's economic recovery.
The PGA suspends players taking part in a new Saudi-backed golf tournament teeing off near London.
Now, European gas prices have soared and there are concerns about global shortages after an explosion at a liquefied natural gas plant in Texas.
Freeport LNG, which operates one of the largest US export plants, will be shut for at least 3 weeks. It comes as Europe is trying to phase out its dependency on Russian fossil fuels.
Well, let's join our correspondent Tony Waterman in Texas. So, Tony, tell us more about the explosion and just how significant this is at a time when the US is trying to increase exports.
Well, Paul, Robin, this is an investigation that is still ongoing. People are trying to figure out what exactly caused this explosion. What we do know at this point is that local officials say that around noon on Wednesday there was a blast. There were no injuries and that the explosion didn't pose any risk to the surrounding community. But they're still trying to figure out what exactly went wrong there. Freeport, though, saying that they are going to be closed for at least the next 3 weeks. So clearly there was some sort of damage, and you can see this massive fireball in the images that were taken of the explosion. And so for the impact, this is kind of a big deal, especially for Europe. You know, there's not this pipeline from us here in Texas over to you guys in Britain that brings natural gas. It has to be liquefied, put on these massive cargo ships, and then shipped across the Atlantic. And this is one of the main facilities in the United States for that liquefaction process. And in the past couple of months, the vast majority of Freeport supply, something along the lines of 70%, has gone over to the EU and to Britain. So this is going to put a major strain on those supplies, particularly at a point when Europe is trying to wean itself off of Russian gas. The hope, of course, is that this is going to be a short-term impact, that things are going to be able to come back online in the next 3 weeks. But of course, nothing is guaranteed at this point.
No, so a really big deal in those extraordinary pictures. We've seen prices already jump today. How much stress is this going to put on global supplies?
Well, LNG, natural gas, it is a global commodity. So when you take a major player offline, that is certainly going to impact supply. We've seen this already, of course, with the prices jumping 9% over in Europe and East Asia, or 4%. Here in the United States, they're actually falling because now the supply has been taken offline. We're not going to have the demand for that. But it's likely going to have an impact, some analysts say, well into July, even though the company says it's only going to be shutting down its operations for at least the next 3 weeks. And what we could perhaps see is some countries priced out of the market, places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. We might actually see that they transition over to coal and oil in the interim because it's just going to get too expensive. The good news for Europe, at least, is that, and for the rest of the Northern Hemisphere, is that we are heading into the summer months. So there is not the same amount of intense demand for natural gas like we see in the winter when people are trying to heat their homes. But this is also a time of the year when companies and governments try to stockpile their supplies for those winter months. Another complicating factor potentially could be that here in southeast United States, we are in hurricane season, and we've seen in past years that there can be damage from these hurricanes that take these type of producers offline. So it sort of seems like there are a lot of different variables that could cause additional strain, but really the importance right now is trying to get this particular facility, which accounts for about a fifth of U.S. LNG exports, to come back online, get back online as quickly as possible. But again, that investigation into what exactly caused this and how extensive the damage is still ongoing.
Tony, thanks so much. Tony Waterman there in Austin.
Climate change is high on the agenda at the Summit of the Americas. From droughts to hurricanes, Latin America and the Caribbean are seeing the impact firsthand. Our correspondent Paulo Cabral has more from Sao Paulo.
Dealing with the historic drought in the state of Paraná in southern Brazil over the last couple of years has been the biggest climate change for this small farmer. Luciane Krupchak, who's been planting vegetables here for over 30 years, says climate change is being tough on her and other farmers in this region.
We noticed that hailstorms have become more frequent, and also droughts. It's always extreme weather, either drought or too much rain.
According to the latest available UN data, between 2008 and 2018, crop and livestock production in Latin America and the Caribbean lost $29 billion due to extreme weather. Over the 20-year period between 2000 and 2019, increasingly severe flooding affected more than 40 million people and caused nearly $26 billion in total damages. Tropical storms and hurricanes led to an estimated $44 billion in losses in Central America and the Caribbean in only 5 years.
We see good signs in the region. We see many countries developing national adaptation plans, which is a way to organize them and set priorities in terms of how they are going to be adapting to climate change. What we do not see yet is a level of investment necessary to adapt cities, to adapt infrastructure, to adapt agriculture, water sector to the scale that is needed.
On Luciane Krupchak's farm, this area will be reforested in partnership with an NGO as part of a project to mitigate the effects of climate change. As the climate changes, the supply of water may be seriously impacted. So this area is being reforested to protect the sources that will feed a major reservoir that's being built in this region.
The river system in this region has been severely hit by a shortage of water because of climate change. And another problem is that a lot of mud is being carried onto the rivers when it rains. So, even when there is a lot of water in rivers, we may not have enough good quality drinking water.
The Miringuava River basin provides nearly half the water for São José dos Pinhais. After the reservoir's completion, it will provide 100% of the city's water and deliver any surplus to the surrounding areas. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São José dos Pinhais, Brazil.
The Paris police chief has apologised for allowing the use of tear gas on football fans waiting to enter the Champions League final between Liverpool and Real Madrid last month. Didier Lallement also admitted that he may have been wrong when he claimed up to 40,000 Liverpool fans tried to enter the Stade de France with fake tickets. European football's governing body UEFA has commissioned an independent review into the chaos.
German investigators are questioning a 29-year-old man who rammed his car into a group of schoolchildren on Wednesday. One teacher was killed and another 29 people injured during the incident in Berlin. Police say they're trying to make sense of his confused statements and are yet to establish a motive. Berlin's mayor describes the man as severely mentally impaired.
In China, 2.7 million people will be tested for coronavirus in 2 Shanghai districts over the weekend. It comes after 4 new cases were reported on Wednesday.
Protests have been taking place outside police headquarters in Sri Lanka's largest city, Colombo, as the nation's most serious economic crisis keeps getting worse. It comes after a night of power cuts, the result of a strike by power workers. Political economist Ahilan Kadigar from the University of Jaffna describes what life is like in Sri Lanka at the moment.
Over the last many months, there has been shortages, particularly of fuel, petrol, diesel, as well as cooking gas. and shortages of food supplies as well, everything from milk powder to imported lentils. And in addition to that, there has been huge price hikes. The price of bread has tripled. The price of rice has doubled. Petrol prices have almost tripled. So it's really hard for working people in particular to make ends meet.
And we're seeing this is the worst economic crisis in 70 years for the country. So how has it got so bad?
One, we had been living beyond our means for a long time. Imports are much higher than our export earnings and foreign remittances and so on. So this crisis was going to come because they'd been living on debt. But the new government that came to power 2.5 years ago, they've really mismanaged the economy. They did nothing, even though the crisis was coming head on. Of course, the pandemic disrupted tourism and any kind of tourism income. And now, more recently, the war in Ukraine has led to tremendous rise in prices in the global markets for commodities and fuel. And so it's a number of factors that have led to this, perhaps the worst economic crisis we have had since independence.
So you talked about shortages of food, also of fuel, of medicines, other essentials. The government says it needs $5 billion over the next 6 months to try and resolve this. Will that be enough?
I think that's just to make ends meet and stabilize the economy. Most economists think that Sri Lanka's economy over the next year is going to shrink by 5 to 10%. In other words, GDP growth is going to be -5 to -10%, which would be the worst economic situation the country has faced ever in its history. So the $5 billion that the Prime Minister is talking about is only to stabilize the situation so that essentials like fuel and food items, medicines can be imported, because we really have a foreign exchange crisis. We don't have enough foreign exchange to be able to import. And we've already defaulted on our debt to our foreign donors. So it's how to manage the situation going forward that he's worried about. But there's still going to be a huge amount of suffering for the people.
Still ahead here on Global Business Europe, new housing policies announced by the UK Prime Minister. But when it comes to safeguarding his leadership, Boris Johnson is still not home and dry.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Marawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
This week on Razor, the great whale mystery, and using zebrafish larvae to predict the success of cancer therapies.
We can do smaller trials and we will have a response much faster, and we will be able to get these new drugs from the research arena to the clinical practice faster.
Welcome back. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised to act on soaring inflation and the cost of living crisis, with a pledge to help first-time homebuyers and council tenants own their own homes.
Critics have dismissed his plan as a distraction from the so-called Partygate scandal and says it will instead push up prices. But Johnson says it's time to act on housing.
I want to talk about the single biggest chunk of household expenditure, and that is the cost of housing itself. Just this year alone, the price of a home in the UK has soared by an average of 9.8% to £278,000, which is £24,000 higher than this time last year.
Dr. Mark Shanahan is head of the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Reading in the UK. He told me that Boris Johnson is on borrowed time.
Apparently we have to draw a line now. It's time for the government to get on with the job and to deliver. And this is what Boris Johnson is trying to show the country today. He has taken his caravan up to Blackpool, up in the northwest of England, and he's doing a big speech about housing today, evoking the spirit of Margaret Thatcher as he attempts to relaunch a right-to-buy scheme so that people who rent their houses rather than own them at the moment have the right to buy. Already, even on the trailed elements of the speech, some critics are picking off the faults on it, so he's not getting away scot-free. And I suspect for most of the country, he really hasn't drawn a line under Partygate, under the Sue Gray investigation, under the confidence vote on Monday, which actually put 41% of his own members of parliament in opposition to him. So it's a tough job, but today is the start for him.
Well, as you say, the idea to draw a line under what's just happened, but we've had multiple Tory grandees, big figures from within his own party, saying that the Prime Minister can't survive this, that he does have to go. Do you think that is what's going to happen, though?
Yes, in short, but it will be a slow death of 1,000 cuts. And this is not a Prime Minister who is the resigning type. So he will hold on for as long as is humanly possible. But he's lost the country. He seems to have lost much of Parliament, and particularly his own backbenchers. And therefore, any policies that he brings forward that tries to appease one wing of his party is really going to annoy the other wings of it. So it's very hard to bring his own party back on side. And as far as the country is concerned, this is a Prime Minister who has been seen to lower the standards of government through all of the Partygate issues, and then go to Parliament and lie about it. And if there is one thing that the country wants from its politicians is integrity. Boris Johnson was elected in 2019 as a very popular Prime Minister. He was a great sloganising Prime Minister, a great campaigner who was going to get things done. Now we're actually stripping the veneers away from that and seeing what he's doing and how he's doing it. And he's just lost his allure. The country no longer trusts him. And worse still for him, it doesn't like him.
But as you say, he's not the resigning type. In fact, he's said that his political career has barely begun. If he digs in, he's safe, isn't he?
Well, he has the hide of a rhino. He fights off criticism. He's something of a rubber ball as well who bounces back. But every leader has their utility value and they have their assets value. And the party are looking very carefully as to whether Boris Johnson is going to be the leader who will win them another term in office. And don't forget, the Conservative Party have effectively been running the government now for the last 12 years. That's a very tired time for any government. They're now looking very carefully to say, is he the man in 2023 or 2024 to win the next general election? And the omens do not look good. Leaders don't bounce back from this kind of confidence vote, where so many MPs rebelled against him. So even though he may be doing what he does best, his boosterism, talking up a great game, the rest of the party are a lot less confident in him and are probably waiting for his next mistake.
The US House of Representatives has passed a sweeping gun control package. It raises the minimum age to buy semi-automatic weapons to 21, but the bill faces longer odds in the Senate. Meanwhile, some people want to expand so-called red flag gun laws, which seek to block unsuitable people from getting their hands on firearms. Our correspondent William Denslow reports now from New York.
In the wake of a national tragedy, an opportunity to take action, to pass legislation so Uvalde doesn't just become the latest location to suffer the horrors of a mass shooting. 19 children and 2 teachers lost their lives when a gunman stormed a Texas primary school on May 24th. The Uvalde shooting came 10 days after 10 people were killed in a shooting at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. Governor Kathy Hochul has vowed to tighten the state's extreme risk protection orders, also known as a red flag law.
The measure was introduced in 2019 and gives relatives, teachers and law enforcement the power to ask the courts to temporarily block an individual from obtaining a firearm if that person is deemed to be a threat to themselves or others.
18 other states have similar pieces of legislation in place. Experts say the effectiveness of these laws can be hard to quantify.
The issue with red flag laws is how do you show they're successful unless there is some anecdotal evidence that's presented to you saying somebody came and they voiced the fact that they wanted to hurt someone and law enforcement went and confiscated the firearms and nobody got hurt.
Supporters of red flag laws say preemptive intervention is a useful tool in getting weapons out the hands of at-risk individuals. In 2018, Texas's Republican Governor Greg Abbott called on state lawmakers to consider red flag legislation. It lacked political support at the time. And speaking at the National Rifle Association's annual conference on May 27th, Abbott said that existing gun control measures in effect nationwide haven't been the answer to gun violence.
Thousands of laws on the books across the country that limit the owning or using of firearms. Laws that have not stopped madmen from carrying out evil acts on innocent people in peaceful communities.
Critics of red flag laws say they're both ineffective and a violation of the US Constitution. Many argue that a greater focus on security is instead required. But the law's advocates say it can be an effective part of a wider gun control strategy, when coupled with proper training and adequate care and support for those deemed to be at risk. A renewed bipartisan effort is currently underway in the Senate to try and get a red flag bill passed. William Denslow, CGTN, New York.
Our main stories again. Slower growth and higher inflation. The European Central Bank has confirmed it plans to raise interest rates for the first time in more than a decade.
China's exports bounce higher than expected, but challenges remain for the country's economic recovery.
Russia flexes its military muscle as Ukraine's president says a brutal battle in Severodonetsk will decide the fate of the entire Donbas region.
And the PGA suspends players taking part in a new Saudi-backed golf tournament teeing off near London.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Yes, thank you. More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com. And do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
Up next on CGTN Africa Live from all the team in London. Goodbye.
Goodbye.